so much. Thank you. So first of all, let me say that I'm really grateful to be here, and thanks to Victor and to Miko for inviting me. This is really a great thing, and thanks to you for coming. And before I start with my actual presentation, Victor asked me to give you some insights about the Austrian environmental history landscape, the research landscapes, and I provided at least one slide. Which shows Austria, of course. You see this tiny little country squeezed in between Germany, Czechia, Hungary, Slovenia, and Italy, and Switzerland, of course. And in Austria, we have at least 4 different cities with universities in which environmental history is really done. I will start with Vienna, of course, because I would say this is the environmental history hub of Vienna, so to say. And I think everybody who is in environmental history or who goes on conferences knows Verena Winnivater. So she is a professor in environmental history. I think one of the few European professors who are really fully devoted to environmental history. She is from her training a trained technical engineer and later studied history. And in Vienna we have a very special or particular situation that the institute where she has her professorship is not at a history institute or a university or a department of history, but at an institute of social ecology. So her main research interests were in the last few years the river-city interactions, but also she is a promoter of what she always calls a strong interdisciplinary environmental history, which means that in Vienna we try to bring natural science and humanities approaches together, which is always a bit difficult, and it's really not mainstream within environmental history, but still there is this Gallic village where we try to do that. And also what she is interested in is the history of soils before the industrialization. Another full professor we have in Vienna is Fridolin Krausmann, and Fridolin Krausmann is also at the Institute of Social Ecology, and his main research interests are really hard quantitative modeling of historical energy flows and the flows of matter. So this is related to the framework of social metabolism or industrial ecology. And the further westwards we come, the more qualitative the work becomes. So in Linz, for example, we have a university, and there is a department of social and economic history, and there Ernst Langthaler works. Ernst Langthaler is a trained historian, but before he became a historian, he worked as a maths teacher, which means that he also tries to combine quantitative research with qualitative research. And his main research interests are agrarian history. So, for example, his habilitation was on the entanglement of agriculture and National Socialism in Austria. And recently he developed a new perspective on the soybean, the global history of soybean, and there he works with a global value chains approach. And then we have another colleague, which is Martin Knoll. Martin Knoll is in Salzburg, and he is a professor for European regional history, and he has a very strong interest also in tourism history. And while I was doing my PhD, I did a PhD in social ecology, and I worked on the development of the winter tourism industry in the Austrian westernmost province of Vorarlberg. And of course, winter tourism is lots about infrastructure and technology, ski lifts, and artificial snowing and things like that. And he was a very close advisor, and I would say a friend. He really helped me to work this whole PhD out. And besides of that, he is also a strong, I think his habilitation was about an environmental history of the early modern period. And then we have another scholar in Austria, which is an environmental historian. This is Patrick Kupper. Patrick Kupper comes from Switzerland. I think before he came to Innsbruck, he worked at the ETH in Zurich, and he has very different research interests nowadays. He works at the Department of Economic and Social History, and his research interests are on energy and infrastructure history, and here mostly on social conflicts that arises when infrastructure projects, large infrastructure projects are implemented. And I think a few years ago he also won the Turku Book Prize, if I'm right, on the transnational history of national parks. I think it was a comparison between the US and the Swiss development. So he has also a strong interest in national parks. Yes, and in between, I mean, this is just the professors. There are a few, of course, a few postdocs and even more doctoral students, but in between Vienna and the tradition of social ecology and Innsbruck and the tradition of social and economic history, there is me. I'm working, and I'm working not only physically because I'm commuting between these places, and I'm working on an environmental history of the Marshall Plan. Yes, and this is not always so easy, especially in terms of methodology. So yes, we could. Now I can give you a few introductory words also on my person. So I am not a historian, not a trained historian. I'm trained as human ecologist. I was trained as a human ecologist, and I specialized on biophysical environmental history. I did my PhD, Verena Winibata, she was my supervisor. I did it at the Institute of Social Ecology, and there I worked out the environmental history of the winter tourism industry and tried to combine a rather biophysical perspective on landscape development, working also with GIS database and statistics, and try to combine this also with approaches from history of technology. So, and infrastructure history, and this interest on history of technology and infrastructure history, this accompanied my work since then. Yeah, and now I would like to get a bit deeper into my actual presentation, which I prepared for today. And now I have to apologize. I really have to write the text because English is not my mother tongue, and yes, and it's easier to, not to mess the whole thing up. So what I present today are some rather preliminary thoughts on how one could write an environmental history of the Marshall Plan. And I came on this topic while I was doing the research on the environmental history of the tourism industry in Austria. Because there I realized the huge importance of the Marshall Plan for the construction of transport infrastructure, which finally laid the ground for the transformation, or how I call it, the acceleration of the arts. And in my current project, which is after 2 years still in an early stage of development, my aim is to use archival holdings primarily on the Marshall Plan and primarily from US archives to develop a better understanding of the post-World War II environmental history of mainly Western Europe. So my presentation today is organized along 4 parts. In the first part, I will give you some facts about the Marshall Plan, which corresponds to textbook knowledge, or so to say, the established narrative. And secondly, I will argue with some examples that this knowledge is incomplete, as long as historians ignore the biophysical dimension of the Marshall Plan. And in the last part, I will try to sketch out an environmental historical or socio-ecological reading of the Marshall Plan by using the sources from US archives. So I spent this spring, I spent 3 weeks in the National Archives in Washington, DC, and I found lots of really great material. And today I mainly refer on the question of energy, in particular of crude oil, and how primarily supply, but also the processing from oil to oil-based products were altered in the course of the Marshall Plan. But now let's start with the established narrative. So after World War II, large parts of Europe's infrastructures and many cities had suffered considerable damage. From 1945 to 1947, US economic assistance to Western Europe, mainly under the framework of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the so-called UNRWA, had amounted to a staggering $9 billion. This program mostly focused on food aid, agriculture, clothes, but also resettlement programs, but it failed to provide sustainable help, not at least because the winter of 1946 was exceptionally hard and long and led to a massive energy crisis. And the following summer of 1947 went down as one of the driest and hottest summers in the climate history of the 20th century. These extraordinary weather events eventually worsened the supply situation in Europe. The situation led US Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs William L. Clayton to recommend a massive injection of economic assistance to Europe after UNRWA phased out. In contrast to UNRWA, however, the assistance should be embedded in a plan that resembled New Deal measures, but went far beyond that, to address the added complexity of the situation. The program itself was announced by George Catlett Marshall in June 1947 under the official name European Recovery Program and became later widespread known as the Marshall Plan. And within the framework, or within this framework, the US poured financial aid totaling $13 billion, which corresponds to about 150 billion at 2017 prices, into Western Europe. Officially, the Marshall Plan spanned 3 years from July 48 to June 51. But how were the ERP funds distributed? The Economic Cooperation Agency, the so-called ECA, was set up mainly consisting of US and European industry representatives. Countries could present requests for deliveries of goods to the ECA, which evaluated and decided them according to a set scheme of priorities. The ECA purchased the goods needed from mostly US producers, and these were then distributed, with the participating countries being obliged to purchase the supplies in national currency for building up so-called national counterpart funds. And they were then administered by the national governments and distributed along so-called long-term reconstruction programs the participants developed under the supervision of the ECA. By doing so, the national economic impact of the Marshall Plan was extended far beyond the direct aid injection. And what was the aim of the Marshall Plan? Of course, to modernize European industrial and business practices by using high-efficiency American models, but also to reduce artificial trade barriers, and the whole program came with a huge technical assistance program also. And the plan was considered as such a success from the contemporary perspective that George Marshall was even awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. And of course, the interest in the Marshall Plan on the part of the scientific community was correspondingly high. How high it was, you can see on the now following slide. So here you see the evaluation. Here you see the results of an evaluation of the database of Google Scholar. So we have altogether at least 54,300 publications that are listed at the moment. In these publications, the search term Marshall Plan is found either in the full text, the title, or in the abstract. Whether the Marshall Plan was centrally discussed or not in these texts is, in view of the large number of entries, of course not determinable. But in the next step, I wanted to get an idea whether this number is high or not, and put it in relation with other search terms. And here you can see the results. For example, the results with the comparison with the term National Socialism, which with 64,800 titles. The German translation of National Socialism, the Nationalsozialismus, with 113,000 entries. Then we have third, we have environmental history with 220,000 entries, and the German translation of reconstruction, the so-called Wiederaufbau, with 65,700 titles. I mean, something like that has, of course, methodological weaknesses. But I think what is obvious is that the Marshall Plan, or what becomes obvious, is that the Marshall Plan is a subject that has already been given some attention from historians. What also can be shown is that the number of publications has been increasing since the 1970s. You see that on the diagram. This can be explained by the fact that the archival holdings from the 1940s and 50s were released those days. And I was also interested in which combination with other search terms the Marshall Plan was used to get an idea in which disciplines the Marshall Plan was studied. And here I proceeded more or less randomly. and tried my hands with all sorts of different search terms. And the 6 most common matches you see over there. And they are not very surprising. The USA first, the second one is Western, the third one is the Marshall Plan and Europe, the fourth is Marshall Plan and Peace, then we have Marshall Plan and Communism, and Marshall Plan and Capitalism. So obviously the Marshall Plan is and was a very popular topic in the history of politics, political sciences, history of diplomacy, and economic history. And these disciplines, and this is really important, also determined which aspects of the Marshall Plan were dealt with and which were not. You may be wondering what this has to do with environmental history. And to discuss this, I would like to invite you to take a little tour de propaganda photography with me. And the following photos all show Marshall Plan funded projects in Europe. So let's start with this one. It shows a hydroelectric power plant under construction on the Rhone River as part of the Marshall Plan. That was those days the world's largest construction project underway. The next one is from a Dutch land reclamation project carried out with Marshall Plan funds. Then we have a photograph of an iron mining site. Then we have a photograph of an iron mining site which was upgraded with Marshall Plan funds. The next one is a thermal power plant in Paris, which was modernized with Marshall Plan money. Then we have a coal mine in Norway that has been upgraded with machinery, of course, by using Marshall Plan money. And last but not least, we have a road construction project in Turkey. The next project is one of my favorites. It shows again a land reclamation project in the Netherlands, but in this case staged as a before-after shot that shows how Marshall Plan money was used to literally change the face of the earth, even if it's just a very small part of the earth. And the next one is from a land reclamation project in Italy. Especially the drainage of wetlands to increase crop yields in agriculture was very popular in the framework of the Marshall Plan. But as I said earlier, the Marshall Plan was also about technical assistance to change production practices. So let's take a look on this aspect. This photograph depicts Austrian engineers who visited the US to study power generators. And one has to mention at this point that Austria used a considerable part of the Marshall Plan to build up hydropower capacities in the Alps and to export its surpluses to Germany. But also agriculture was about technology transfer, as you see in the next photograph. Here you see Dutch farm boys which traveled to the US to learn more about the mechanization of farm work. The next one shows Turkish boys and men who were taught by Americans about the advantages of tractors. And next we have a picture of a helicopter that was used to spray DDT on French fields, followed by an ECA advertisement that promoted the Marshall Plan fertilizer campaign to boost agricultural harvests, so to say the European variant of the Green Revolution, which included not only mechanization and chemization, but also the promotion of fast-growing, high-yielding hybrid seeds, as you see on the next photograph. This is taken from the gift shop of the Marshall Plan Foundation, and it should remember that hybrid corn also found its way to Europe in the course of the Marshall Plan. So to sum this up, although one must be very aware that these are propaganda images, they show one thing very clearly. The measures of the Marshall Plan also served to transform nature in order to provide resources for the industrial development of Europe. And as I said in the beginning, the Marshall Plan came with the obligation that the aid was given to those in need in return for a payment in national currency, which was then collected in the so-called counterpart funds. So building up counterpart funds was a condition to receive Marshall aid. And that's a very important point, because normally when historians talk about the Marshall Plan, they usually talk about the period between 1948 and 52. And why is that? The counterpart funds were managed by European governments in national programs, as for example in the case of the French Monet Plan or the Italian Fondo Lira. Nevertheless, these funds were part of the Marshall Plan designed as such, and its distribution was supervised by the ECA. However, the participating countries had a certain degree of freedom to decide how they would use the money as long as it was approved by the ECA. Thus, we find very different investment paths in Europe. According to Alan Milward, especially in Austria, Germany, Italy, and France, these countries use the counterpart funds to establish long-term infrastructure development programs, while, for example, the UK and Norway used counterpart funds mainly for combating inflation. And here on the slide, you see the distribution of the counterpart funds in the participating countries from 1948 to 53. In total, it was 38 billion US dollars from the counterpart accounts from 1948 to 53. And when we take a closer look on the distribution of the counterpart funds along the different sectors, then we see that around about a quarter was used for improving energy production and distribution, such as power station buildings, high voltage lines, transnational grids, and so on. The next in line is the transport and communication sector, with 20% of the counterpart funds. This money was utilized for the construction of roads and railway systems, tunnels, bridges, but also to design a European-wide motorway network and to upscale capacities of river and sea ports and waterways. Another 16% was invested in a variety of agricultural projects such as land reclamation, drainage, irrigation, fertilizer campaigns, and the rationalization of agriculture. And finally, with a 12% counterpart share, we have measures aimed at making the mining sector more efficient, such as mechanizing coal and ore extraction, but also drilling for oil and natural gas in order to improve the resource base of national economies and to reduce the dependence on imports. So unfortunately, I can't go too much into detail here, especially since to date no one has ever undertaken a systematic bottom-up reconstruction of the multitude of interventions carried out with the counterpart funds. All the information we have is the statistically aggregated figures by sector, without knowing exactly for which practices and technologies the money was used and how this shaped the environmental history of Western Europe. But to sum the breakdowns up, here we see that about 3/4 of all counterpart investments between 48 and 53 aimed at efficiency increasing projects in landscapes for economic purposes, or to put it in an environmental historical sense, to commodify nature in order to turn it into a resource for the reconstruction of European industrial production. So at this point, I would like to give you a first interim conclusion by quoting the Italian economic historians Francesca Fauri and Paolo Tedeschi, and they worked primarily on the Marshall Plan and the industrial development in Italy. And they argued that the Marshall Plan organized the largest successful simultaneous transfer of technologies ever experienced in the world. And further in the text they mention that it supported the simultaneous recovery of most of the European nations, but less is known about the impact of the Marshall Plan on the modernization of the European industry. And I would like to add on that even lesser is known about the socio-ecological impact of this project on, for example, landscapes or resource flows. And now we come to the third part. And now I would like to discuss how the environmental historical potential of the Marshall Plan could be harnessed. And I will start with using data and literature from the debate of the Great Acceleration. Many of you are familiar with the graphs that are shown here. They come from the article The Anthropocene, Conceptual and Historical Perspectives, published by Will Steffen et al. In 2011. All of these charts show the now famous form of the hockey stick curves. Indeed, these graphs represent macro trends, and by doing so they are a bit problematic as they treat humanity as homogeneous. But what the authors are trying to show is that, and here I quote, the human enterprise switched gears after World War II. The change was so dramatic that the 1945 to 2000 plus period has been called the Great Acceleration. And if we proceed a bit further in the text and examine how the authors explain the emergence of the Great Acceleration, we learn the following, and here I quote again from the paper. What finally triggered the Great Acceleration after the end of World War II? This war undoubtedly drove the final collapse of the remaining pre-industrial European institutions that contributed to the Depression and indeed to the Great War itself. But many other factors also played an important role. New international institutions, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, were formed to aid economic recovery and fuel renewed economic growth. Led by the USA, the world moved towards a system built around neoliberal economic principles characterized by more open trade and capital flows. The post-World War II economy integrated rapidly, with growth rates reaching their highest values ever in the 1950 to 1973 period. Other factors also contributed to the Great Acceleration. The war produced a cadre of scientists and technologists, as well as a spectrum of new technologies, most of which depended on the cheap energy provided by fossil fuels, that could then be turned towards the civil economy. Partnerships among governments, the industry, academia became common, further driving innovation and growth. More and more public goods were converted into commodities and placed into the market economy, and the growth imperative rapidly became a core societal value that drove both the socio-economic and the political spheres. Although I would say, at least in my eyes, that this quote only superficially sketches the changes that took place after 1945, there seems in my eyes to be a certain overlap with the activities of the Marshall Plan. In other words, I would like to ask if the conditions for the possibility of the Great Acceleration were created by capital, knowledge, and technology transfer between the US and Western Europe. And this brings me to the last part of my presentation, dealing with the entanglement of the Marshall Plan and crude oil, respectively the construction and expansion of oil refineries in Western Europe. So this part is mostly based on archival sources from the National Archive. And at the moment, I'm in the middle of evaluating these sources, so this is a really true work in progress, and you are actually the first audience with whom I share this. So the image you see here on the slide is from a refinery in Le Havre, which was destroyed by air raids during the war and later rebuilt with Marshall Plan money. So let's start with a very quantitative overview on the role of oil and oil refineries in the Marshall Plan. The figures you see here on the slide, they are from the work of the US historian David Painter, who dealt with this question in the 1990s. In the first column, you see the Marshall Plan aid in each participating country. And in the second column, you see the share of the Marshall Plan that was spent on the import of crude oil or petroleum products, such as gasoline, diesel, heating oil, and so on, into the participating countries. All in all, we see that the shares for importing oil considerably differed. There are countries like Sweden, where almost 50% of the Marshall Plan, of the total Marshall Plan, was used to import crude oil or oil products. This is obviously the case because the Swedish landscapes had little to offer in this regard. And then we have other countries like Austria, where not even 1% was used to procure oil, because Austria had its own oil fields, although these fields were occupied by the Soviets this time. And when we look at the average, then we see that about 10.6%, then we see that it was about 10.6%. So to sum this up, oil and oil products was, according to David Painter, the most important single commodity within the framework of the Marshall Plan. And in the next two columns, colored in green, you can see the available refinery capacities in the participating countries. And here in the very last row, we can see the capacity and how it is developed. And we see actually that the capacity of the refineries during the Marshall Plan nearly tripled. And this is a very interesting aspect, which has not been studied until now. One of the aims of my project is to gain a fuller picture of the European situation and especially of the national developments out of these sources, and by doing so getting a better idea of the European oil politics in the post-war decades. So now, after we looked on this quantitative overview, I would like to invite you to take a look on a broader picture of oil trade between the 1930s and the 1950s. Not only the refinery capacity has increased enormously, but the entire global oil trade was restructured in the years of World War II. Here on the slide you can see a graphics taken out of the sources that compares the situation before and after World War II. It becomes clear that before the Second World War, most of the oil came from the US and from Southern America to Europe, mostly in the form of oil products. European refineries, which existed actually since the interwar years, were primarily focused on the processing of domestic oil from European oil wells, but rarely utilized imported crude oil. After World War II, the situation had completely changed. From then on, the main supplier was the Middle East, while the USA successively cut back its crude oil deliveries to Europe. However, even if European oil supplies did not come from the US anymore, they were extracted in the Middle East by mostly US oil corporations. This reorientation of global oil trade during the Marshall Plan should have ensured that helping Europe meeting its energy needs would not impose an undue drain on the US domestic oil resources or impair the fulfillment of the vital needs of the people. And on this diagram, you see also the global refinery situation in 1952. So in total, by that time, there were 84 refineries in Western Europe. This is the yellow share. Mainly specialized on Middle Eastern oil. So what we see here is that the European refinery capacity ranked on a global scale behind the USA with 329 plants and the whole Western Hemisphere, an area that comprised Latin America, Australia, and so on. So, but what has this to do with the Marshall Plan and the counterpart funds? So when George Catlett Marshall gave his first speech on the Marshall Plan in June 1947, it just took 3 weeks for the Committee of European Economic Cooperation to be formed to support the Marshall Plan by drawing up national reconstruction plans. This committee was already converted in 1948 into the permanently existing Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the so-called OEEC, which later became the OECD. The OEEC had an important role in planning and coordinating measures to foster economic growth in the aftermath of World War II. But their interests were, of course, a bit broader than just the monetary sphere of economic planning. The OEEC had a whole series of so-called technical committees for industry and for energy, which also dealt with economic and technical issues relating to resource utilization. One of the tasks of the OEEC was to develop a refinery expansion program for Europe, supported by the ECA. Whose role was in this regard rather consultative. However, the ECA was also the authority, as mentioned before, that evaluated the Marshall Plan projects, as well as counterpart projects, and ultimately decided if they would support them financially or not. So both the ECA and the OEEC worked hand in hand to accelerate the flow of oil products into and through Europe. So when I brought the diagram here on the slide shows the planning of the Western European refinery output. 1938, which is on the very left, was assumed as the reference year for all of these plans. The diagram here clearly shows that the demand for oil products was at least 3 times higher than the output of the refineries in 1938. And this was, as I said before, also an expression of the extremely limited crude oil availability in Europe. After the Second World War, consumption had risen again. From the point of view of the Marshall Plan experts, this was one reason why the European post-war economy only recovered very slowly. After all, enormous sums of money had to be spent to finance the import of petroleum products. The Marshall Plan had relieved this burden somewhat. However, in order to permanently reduce dollar expenditures, it was necessary to build up refineries in Europe. This way, the dollar deficit could be kept as low as possible. This shift enabled Western Europe to import more oil at lower costs, but it also deprived oil-producing countries of the added value they would have received from processing their own resources. In the medium term, however, the goal of the ECA and the OEEC was to produce more oil products in Europe than could be sold on European markets in order to have an additional source of income with which crude oil imports could be permanently financed. We see this on the diagram when we look at the time after 1953. Here the planned output exceeds the demand. This means that the refinery expansion program aimed to turn Western Europe into an exporter of oil products. So let's go one step further. On the following picture, we see a bit more detailed information about the different single refineries that were included in the refinery expansion program. On the one hand, we see the exact location and the name of the refineries. This is extremely useful for historians, as it allows us to map the refinery locations and its relation to other kinds of infrastructure, such as ports, for example, railway stations, and later, of course, pipelines. What we also see in these sources is which technologies were used at this time and the quantities of petroleum products that could be produced with the technology in question. And last but not least, these sources also shows us how the objectives of the OEEC should be achieved by a gradual upscaling of the resource throughput. But there is a bit more we can reconstruct from the sources in the National Archive. And I will go on now. Firstly, we get very detailed information on how the increase in refinery capacity was financed and from which sources the funding originated. Here we have the French example, and we see the estimated costs for the envisioned upscaling, but also the contribution expected from the ECA. In this case, the French authorities expected around $8.2 million, either from the Marshall Plan or the counterpart funds for the expansion of the French refinery capacity. As we can read in the text below the figures, only 2 out of 5 refinery projects were recommended for funding by the ECA. The reason for this can be reconstructed from the files, but it's unfortunately too early now to give you more detailed information on how the specific plans were selected. But what we can see very clearly from this example is that even if the ECA did not finance a project, they had a very good understanding of what the project would look like. Also because many resources, machineries or spare parts for the expansion of the refinery capacities were supplied by US American companies. So one could argue that accelerating Western Europe by upscaling refinery capacity was a huge business, not only for the oil industry, but especially for the supplier industry. And this we see in a very great detail on the next image. On this page, on this slide, we see the material requirements for a refinery project in the UK. We see the different plant components and raw materials that had to be procured for this project. In this case, not according to economic values, but in tons. It is interesting to see that we essentially have 2 different countries of origin, the UK and the US. And if we look at the different goods, then it becomes clear that the majority of the building materials, for example, such as lumber, cement, but also the tank containers, came from Great Britain, while the more complex machine parts, such as electrical equipment, pumps, compressors, and so on, came from the US. And at this point, it's a question how to interpret this. But what this demonstrates is that the acceleration of European oil flows was made possible by an increase of existing infrastructure stocks. So accelerating flows of oil do not only increase the CO2 emissions, it also requires much more land, and by doing so causes harm to biodiversity and so on. In any case, there is also information, and I hope you can see that at least a little bit, on the trade links established as part of the refinery expansion program. The picture shows the suppliers of a French refinery. In this case, it's a refinery financed by the Marshall Plan, and the evaluation of such lists would probably allow us to reconstruct transnational trade links, but also to perceive the refinery plants from a broader perspective as nodes in a much more complex network of the extended enterprise. And last but not least, I would like to point out an essential aspect that can be reconstructed from the files, and that is the ownership structure of the refineries. And here on the last photograph, we see an overview of German refineries. On the far right, in the column ownership, we can read who owned the refineries. In this way, it would be possible to reconstruct relatively precisely which companies controlled the flow of crude oil in Europe and who profited from the conversion of crude oil into oil products. That was now a very small insight into the really very extensive file material we brought from the US. And as already mentioned, at this point, I'm not at the point where I could really evaluate the whole source material accordingly. So therefore, I can only give you, or can only offer you, a very provisional conclusion at this point. So first of all, I would like to say that I'm personally deeply convinced that the Great Acceleration is a very useful concept for understanding the environmental history of Western Europe in the 20th century. But for that, the concept has to be thought differently. As it is now, the acceleration of growth rates of socio-economic and Earth system trends results, as the authors explained it, from a self-reinforcing process driven by economic and population growth and technological change. My proposal would instead be to focus on those group of actors who were driving the acceleration of resource flows, who benefited from it, but also to ask how and with which side effects this acceleration was implemented politically, technically, and socially. Also, it seems to me particularly relevant to capture the Western European perspective on the Great Acceleration. Why? Firstly, because Western Europe was the first world region into which the US exported a resource appropriation pattern that turned out to be rather unsustainable in the long run. Other world regions followed in later decades, not at least because reconstructing Europe with the Marshall Plan was considered as an extraordinary success case. Secondly, because this would allow us to lead the discussion of European integration, of the European integration after 1945, also on an environmental historical level. Here there is already a very important contribution of the Tensions of Europe group with its concepts of the hidden integration of Europe by infrastructure. Although it has to be said, and it's a pity, that the biophysical aspects plays a rather disordered role in their work. The study of petroleum refineries or oil refineries is particularly suitable here, as these have been hardly studied from a historical perspective. But at the same time, they played a major role in the energy supply of Western Europe. One could argue that they served as critical infrastructure hubs in the Great Acceleration. With these infrastructures, it became possible to import cheap crude oil instead of more expensive petroleum products, and the value added in Western Europe could be reinvested to finance the permanent national trade deficits. It almost seems as if the planned expansion of the oil refineries created a geopolitical but also an infrastructural lock-in effect, which solidified the oil path in the long term, though jeopardizing the future of humanity in the longer run. This lock-in effect was further solidified by huge investments of the Marshall Plan and the counterpart-funds into the automotive industry, but also the promotion of agricultural machinery, the desertification of railways, and the use of oil burners in different industry types. So, to come to an end without arguing that the Marshall Plan and the counterpart-funds triggered the Great Acceleration, I'm pretty convinced that using sources on infrastructure and industry projects carried out during the Marshall Plan provides an extraordinary useful lens to learn more about the Great Acceleration and how it was made, especially in Western Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.